Hello YouTube. Today I'd like to talk about a video I saw some weeks ago by Jason Maggard. It's called "The Population Hoax Exposed at Airports," and it's quite a funny video. It's kind of like one of the conspiracy theories that might have surfaced back in the early days of the internet. Sort of a fun conspiracy theory of the kind like blue skies on Mars, chemtrails, HAARP, fluoride in the water, that sort of thing. It's kind of rooted in reality, but adds a sort of an extra twist to everything. Of course, I believe in most of these conspiracies of HAARP isn't really a conspiracy, it's well known. Fluoride in the water is obviously well known, and its effects are disputed, but yeah, I mean, those are all separate subjects that you can look into yourself. The basis of the population hoax is that it's kind of like probably rooted in flat earth, that kind of area of what would you call it, like crackpot conspiracy theories, if you're into that kind of terminology. But the basic theory of it is obviously that there are a lot, the current estimate of human population is that it's about, I think it's 7 billion as it stands at the moment, people on Earth. And so there's obviously people out there who are suggesting that the population of the Earth is much less than that, probably around 1 billion or so. And the way that this YouTuber attempts to prove that is by looking at the number of air passengers or visitors to this airport, the Port of Seattle, I believe it is. SeaTac Airport has 46.9 million passengers a year, 9th busiest in the nation. So, that sounds like a large number. And then the video consists of him basically walking around this SeaTac Airport, sort of trying to count the number of people that go through the terminal to see if it equals that of the number that they say. So he's just trying to get a visual estimate on the day that he's there to see if the numbers add up. So, I mean, you can watch the video and decide for yourself what you think, if you think he has a point or not. I personally disagree with his conclusions, and you can see why, especially if you go through and read the comment sections here. People break it down. They use maths to break down the number of people going through the airport as according to the airport estimates, and just extrapolate basically on that. So that information is there, and I did the numbers myself, and it works out for sure. So I don't think this is particularly good evidence of a population lie or a hoax. What I will say is that I've had this sneaking suspicion about this before, though, that the world's population mightn't be as high as they say it is. And what got me thinking about it was how one day I was looking for a lot of door stops to buy so that I could create a sculpture with, and here's the sculpture that I made here. But the point is that I had to buy like all the door stops in this shop. It was a euro pound shop kind of thing. So I went in and I bought maybe 8 packets of door stops, each one with like 4 door stops in it, and basically cleaned out the whole shop. Then I went back a few weeks later to buy more, and they were sold out, obviously, still. They hadn't reordered them or anything. So I thought that odd. I mean, I felt a little bit bad for anybody who might have needed a doorstop, but then again, you know, you can just use a bit of paper or whatever. But this is, just to be clear now, this is in a fairly densely populated area, so you'd imagine that people need such items, but perhaps there are other places to get them in the area. I don't know, of course there would be, but so this shop never restocked them anyway, and I couldn't find them anywhere else. So I decided that I might as well contact the manufacturer to see if they'd send them to me in bulk or something along those lines. But the manufacturer obviously never got back to me. So this kind of led me to question, you know, it's sort of you're kind of questioning reality and wondering, do they really, like, you know, you go into these shops and you're looking around for things, do they really produce enough items for people? Or is it just, you know, they're just producing a certain amount, and then when that gets used up, they like don't have any more of it in stock. Don't know if I'm explaining myself very well there. You know, the idea of like, what if the Earth was like, it's like a Truman Show, you know? They say 7 billion, they say it's like this big planet, but really they've just made, there's like limited resources, so they just like put as much out there to give the impression of like of abundance, or you know, a cornucopia of materials that they've created and that they're promoting to sell. But in actuality, you know, this idea of the economy having this like not an unlimited supply but a large supply of things is actually sort of a lie. They only really have a small amount of stuff at any one time, and if you go and buy it all, then that's it. They're kind of screwed for the next while until they get more of it. So I hope I'm kind of explaining that correctly. So it's kind of so this isn't so much a population hoax, although it would be kind of related, but it's more of like a supply and demand hoax, that there isn't really as much commercial goods available as they'd like you to believe there is, and that really each one of these little doorstops that they make is kind of like, it's not just a disposable object, it's like a thing that actually takes quite a lot of time and effort to make, which it would, like I certainly couldn't make, I'd have a hard time making a doorstop, you know, getting the proper plastics and developing it from scratch, I mean, building the mold and all of that, which is why I had to obviously source them from somewhere else. Now, when you think about cars and you start blowing it up and bricks, mortar, computers, radios, books, and all these things, it's quite obvious that there is an awful lot of stuff on the planet, and that people do build and make a lot of things. So I'm not seriously pushing this idea, but I just thought it was something funny that I noticed, and so I thought I'd share it with you. I'll just say a little bit about the sculpture. There's about 24 doorstops in this, each one bound together with elastic bands, and it made a cool little stand. I had another sculpture that sat in the middle of this, but I can't find the pictures of those at the moment. So recently, just today in fact, Richard Hall, who runs Rich Planet, which is a kind of a conspiracy UFO website, and he posts videos on YouTube as well, he looked into he was looking into the idea of population control. So this is kind of the opposite of the population hoax. The idea here is that there's too many people on the planet and you want to reduce them. So he's come up with a formula here of how a obviously babies are the thing that cause population to grow, obviously. So if you're trying to reduce the number of people on the planet because of resources and such, then you want to look at the entire equation of how it comes to be that babies are made. So he looks at it as you need a woman, a man, a heterosexual woman, a man, and they need to want to have sex together in order for babies to be produced. So he looks at how you would alter the elements on this side of the equation to change the outcome here to 0 or no baby. And he does that by suggesting that you change the heterosexual nature of these two individuals to homosexual. So the woman becomes a lesbian, man becomes a gay man, or you could change them to be bisexual. So he puts an L here, a G here. Yeah, you see L, G. Then he discusses the bisexual aspects, because obviously you're not going to be able to change everyone to lesbian or gay, but you might get them halfway between, which may affect something, I guess. And then the fourth change you could make here is to change the woman into a man and the man into a woman. So that becomes like the transgender issue, which has cropped up a lot recently. So once you have those 4 LGBT elements in play, then you've ruled out this matchup. But obviously that's only going to affect a certain percentage of the population, no matter how hard you push it. Not everyone's going to become gay or lesbian or whatever. So the second element in the equation here is also important, sex. And he runs through a number of different ways that you could diminish sexual contact between straight couples. And one of the major ones that he talks about is fear. So you try and make the individuals afraid of having sex. Certainly one of the biggest areas in this, especially during the 80s and 90s, would have been, sexually transmitted diseases, so AIDS, that kind of thing. But he also talks about the more recent allegations that cropped up in the media about sexual assaults. And so even if a man is trying to court a woman into having sex, he becomes afraid that even by talking to her in a manner, or maybe touching her, that he will be brought up in court on charges of sexual assault or rape. So this is obviously going to limit the man's drive to want to contact a woman in that way. So it's interesting. Now, there's also a lot of other ways that this occurs in it, that these kinds of issues are promoted in the, what would you say, in the media. So perhaps a good example here would be this video I found of Stacey Dash on the Cosby Show. This is only one example. I might do a whole series on this, of how television ruined your life. It's a bit like I believe Charlie Brooker did a series similar to that with a similar title. Might even be the same title. TV ruined your life. But it was good and it was funny. Charlie Brooker does a good show called Newswipe, and I think it might have been part of that. But hopefully if I do a series on it anyway, mine will be slightly different. We'll have a different end premise, for example, and we'll be focusing on TV shows mainly from the 80s and 90s, because I think that those are obviously the ones that have affected the current generation of millennials. So let's just go ahead and look at this video. This is obviously a video of very young Stacey Dash here on the Cosby Show. There's Bill Cosby, which is also kind of funny because Dr. Huxtable, or Bill Cosby, was also involved in certain rape allegations, although those to do with drugs and stuff. So it's not quite on the same level of as just like touching a woman's knee or something. Let's have a look at this anyway. See, that was it. She's obviously a teenager. She's still in school, and he asks her, "Are you pregnant? You better flip and not be." Like, look at the face on him. So this is a kind of, a culture, an example of what the culture was like in 1980. It's like, if you are a young teen and you get involved with a girl, young teenage girl, and you get involved with boys, you better be sure that you aren't having sex with them. And if you are, you should be using a condom or some kind of contraceptives. So that is another important issue here in sex, would be like abortion, legalizing abortion, which we just had in Ireland, woohoo, and contraceptions, so which was also legalized. And that's all down to kind of promoting sex as not for reproduction but for purely for pleasure. So that's exactly what that is. But here, like, so yeah, you're all allowed to have sex for pleasure and all, but if you happen to be in your like most fertile years, make sure you're not having a child out of wedlock. Now, there is something to be said for that, obviously, because that's quite a conservative position. You shouldn't be having children out of wedlock, and you should be able to provide for them. Although it's getting harder and harder to do these days. But certainly, it's more about the structure of society. So here's a woman, maybe she's 17, 18, and she could easily be married at this point and beginning to raise a family. So then she'd be like having kids all the way through her 20s, possibly even into her 30s, and then you'd have loads of children. Each family would have plenty of kids. But here it kind of like, almost a sense of threat involved in them. Yeah, like kind of threatening, you better not be pregnant because of how it's going to reflect on your parents, like that they didn't raise you properly, even though there's absolutely nothing wrong with a perfectly fit young woman having children. So that's just one example. I mean, there would be numerous examples of examples like this from TV shows in the 80s that I'm going to look at. You'd have, I don't know, Taxi and Family Ties, I'm sure has elements, maybe the A-Team, Rags to Riches, My Two Dads, although that might have been My Two Dads. So that's a fairly good example because it's kind of promoting homosexual relationships already, even back in the 80s. Yeah, so those with a sustained psychological campaign like that through the media, essentially brainwashing young children into thinking that the elements involved would be like thinking women don't want sex and that men are mad to have sex. So when in fact that's not really the case in either situation all the time. So then trying to constantly push this sort of feminist agenda of having men and women equal, so that all the gender roles that previously applied for women, such as being a mother and raising children, no longer exist. They're now out there, career women, just as good as men. And then, but at the same time, keeping all of the gender roles for men in place, heterosexual men that is. They still have to provide, it's changing a bit maybe, but ultimately men don't really want to be stay-at-home dads. Some of them do, but there's still you wouldn't, a lot of guys I'd say would have an issue like even possibly being in a relationship with a woman that earns more than them, It's just like basic instincts about who's the provider and, who wears the trousers in a relationship kind of thing. You don't really want to be ruled by a woman in a relationship. What is the point? Because you probably go off with someone else who's more manly. But obviously not in all cases. But it's hard to alter, human biology on that level just through even with this kind of brainwashing that went on in the 80s. It's just difficult to change the basic way that male-female interactions have worked over millions of years of evolution. Okay, so what are the effects of this kind of population control where the numbers of people, certainly in rural areas in Ireland, for example, there's a huge drop in rural populations. There's effectively like ghost towns out there. There's very few people living in them. So, obviously since white European people and white Americans, for example, aren't having as many kids anymore, certainly not up to replacement levels, the solution then is to bring in immigrants from Africa and other third world countries or the Middle East to begin to breed and so that the economy keeps running. This idea that, and this is because we live in sort of a consumer society where our economy has to be growing all the time, this idea of continuous growth. So if you're limiting if you're limiting the population, how do you continue to grow the economy? Obviously you have to bring in new people from other places, and this is going to disrupt social cohesion and ultimately change the culture and the racial demographic of the original countries, which is the plan. Is it the Kalergi plan for Europe? And there's other sources for this as well. So in talking about population and economics with supply and demand, this is a thread here on an archive. If supply and demand is a thing and it's getting harder and harder for fast food employers to find and keep workers, then why aren't they responding to this market demand by raising wages? This is a very good question, I think. Economists always talk about if there's a scarcity in the market, then, so if there's a lack of, gold or something, gold's going to cost more, but if there's gold flooding the market, the price will go down. So the original poster they're talking about, I've been in several shitty jobs where they may as well just put a revolving door on facilities with as much turnover as they have. If they're having that much trouble keeping help, then why don't they raise the wages? Their businesses are also suffering with low sales, poor performance, etc. Are they just too stupid, or is it mismanagement? What incentive is preventing businesses like these from raising wages when a lack of properly trained workers is hurting their business? So you get the idea. It's again about supply and demand to do with employers. There could be any number of reasons for mismanagement, a reflexive phenomenon where poor performance leads to the idea of labour cost cutting, then angling to exploit the HB visa programs by saying, golly gosh, there's just no workers who want to work for half their worth, etc. But I already said that markets have no tendency towards equilibrium. So this is the main point. What's your evidence for this? Hang on a sec. The extensively defined prerequisites for equilibrium theory to hold true don't exist in reality in any market. And then the other poster responds, that's an argument from logic, but I asked for evidence. I'll even grant that you're probably right, because economists are 100% fucking idiots who couldn't hack it in a trading pit. But I would like to an example of a market that doesn't trend towards equilibrium. Fair question. Oh wow, lol. I actually burst out laughing from that. Okay, literally every stock, commodity, currency market, etc. operate off of reflexivity with no tendency towards equilibrium. Perpetual flux is entirely antithetical to the concept of equilibrium, and some natural tendency towards per rata efficiency. Secondly, every consumer good market operates off of monopolistic competition, meaning producers such as price setters, which is again antithetical to equilibrium. So that's the basic point there. Perpetual flux is entirely antithetical to the concept of equilibrium. But just keeping it on the subject that we were talking about, which was wages and such, if wages are fixed without consideration to supply and demand, then they are not in perpetual flux and are by your definition therefore in constant equilibrium. So see the problem with discussing economics, most people don't understand the theories that they're trying to defend. If wages are fixed, I never said they were, just as rates are not determined by intersection of supply and demand, but they kind of are fixed without consideration to supply and demand. So he's dodging the question there, because the number of workers go down, the supply goes down, but the wages don't go up, so they are fixed relative to supply and demand. He says they aren't fixed, but they clearly are, which is what we're arguing. Supply of steel goes down, the price of their product and manufacturing costs go up. Okay, so let's continue on. Every consumer good market operates off of monopolistic competition, meaning products act as price setters. And yet if those same producers make a product out of steel and the supply of steel goes down, the price of their product and manufacturing cost goes up, which is not antithetical to equilibrium, but demonstrative of it. Again, this appears another example of corrupt academics feeding off. Okay, so, and now you're just assuming equilibrium as a normative is the response. So this idea of normative economics comes up here. Normative economics, as opposed to positive economics, is a part of economics that expresses value or normative judgments about economic fairness, or what the outcome of the economy or goals of public policy ought to be. So an example of normative economic statements is as follows. The price of milk should be $6 a gallon to give dairy farmers a higher standing of living and to save the family farm. This is a normative statement because it reflects value judgments. This specific statement makes the judgment that farmers deserve a higher living standard and that farms ought to be saved. Right, so it's obvious why this is wrong as a statement, because the price of milk should be $6 a gallon. What effect is that going to have on the consumer market at $6 a gallon? Like, it would drive the price of milk up, and that would be unfair to the consumer. So, but you can't have farmers going out of business either, so then you have subsidies, which is really just coming out of people's taxes anyway, so they're paying for this $6 a gallon just through their taxes. Ignoring that, when used here, now you're just assuming equilibrium as a normative is just it's not only a nonsense statement really, but it's also an incorrect use of the term normative in regard to the price of steel goes down and the price of their product goes up. It's just a dishonest use of the word. But I find it interesting because using this term normative economics, you could basically justify anything. You could say, well, your wages suck. Wouldn't it be nice if we could raise your wages to fit so that it keeps up with inflation or housing price bubbles or whatever, yeah, it would be good. But that's a normative statement. There's what you want, like your value judgment of that. People should be able to afford a good standard of living. And then there's the reality where you just can't do that. So another example of this would be like you're lying on the ground and someone's standing on your neck and you ask them, "Oh, please, would you get off my neck?" And they go, yeah, well, that's such a normative statement, because while it would be nice if I wasn't standing on your neck, the reality is that I am. So, get used to the reality, basically, because it's not going to change. So I thought that was a revealing kind of look into economist terms and their bullshit. There's another aspect of economics that I think is important, and the supply and demand issue, which is to do with planned obsolescence. So everyone knows about planned obsolescence or built-in obsolescence, or the majority of people do by now, which is that in this day and age, well, formerly things were built to last. So if you bought a car, they built it so that it wouldn't break down, and if it needed repairs, there were replacement parts readily available. Same with things like fridges, cookers, ovens, even like brooms and everything. Basically, every consumer product was built so that it had a certain standard and it would last. It would have like a lifetime guarantee in some cases. Even things like light bulbs. I believe there's a light bulb in a fire department somewhere in America that was switched on about 80 years ago or something, or 50 years ago, and it's still lighting. It's not giving off a huge amount of light, but the filament is still working. As anyone else knows, as anyone who uses light bulbs in their house in general, which is most people obviously, knows that light bulbs just go like quite regularly. And all of that is to do with the idea of manufacturing costs, that if you're producing light bulbs, you want people to, or any light bulbs, maybe not such a great example, but the point is that if the manufacturer were to, build a perfect fridge that lasted that person a lifetime, then they'd never see that customer come back into their door again, because they have the item and they're not going to come back and buy another fridge. So they build a failure into the product, so people have to come back and spend more and more money. And then you could just say that it's greed, that they just do it because they want more money. But the argument they use is that it's not because they want more money, although they obviously do, but they're saying that it just wouldn't be economically viable to run a business the other way. And I was thinking that it probably is economically viable, but certainly, like, if you had a population that was growing all the time, then you'd have new families popping up continuously. So they'd be able to just go, each new family would be buying a new fridge, and then those families would be having kids, and they'd grow up, and then they'd need a new fridge. So you'd always be manufacturing new fridges to meet the demand, which would be a demand by population growth. And that should be enough for any business. So I think that the reason for planned obsolescence isn't greed, and it's not about basic economic concerns, but it's rather about the fact that our populations are becoming stagnant. So if we want to get rid of this, then we should probably, well, we're never going to get rid of this, but obviously from the point of view of resources, and if you're talking about the ecology and people going on about climate change and such, which is obviously another lie, planned obsolescence just isn't feasible in that regard. And yet it's perfectly backed up by economists and governments who are all clamoring about climate change and the effect we're having on the environment. So clearly there's an issue there, a double standard, if you will. So if you wanted, basically what I'm suggesting would be, if you wanted to get rid of planned obsolescence for the sake of the environment, then we need to return our society back to a status where you don't have this LGBT thing going on, and you don't have all of these psychological operations against sex. And you return people to a state where they are in a position to be a heterosexual man and a heterosexual woman, and that a man can work and afford enough to support an entire family, with the woman in the gender role bringing up the children. So yeah, if you want to, save the environment and stop planned obsolescence, then one way of doing that would be to have the population growing at a steady rate, which would allow for little junior here to grow up, become a man or possibly a woman, and then go ahead and create more babies and buy more products, and so the circle of life continues. Okay, thanks for watching. If you like this video, leave a like and subscribe. Cool.